Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Write Project podcast and radio program. This is a show about writing and modern Newfoundland author culture. This program is produced and recorded at CHMR FM 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is aired on other great stations in the province and elsewhere in the country. It can also be heard online at www.chmr.ca. I'm your host, Matthew LeDrew, author of such novels as Touch Your Nose and Jacoby Street, and founder of Engen Books. Let's see what we have today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us for another very special episode of the Write Project podcast. I know I say that they are all special, but this one really is. I am on the line with Daze Jefferies, the author, the amazing author behind a lot of different work that's come out of this province recently. She was featured in Transversing. She was featured in Land of Many Shores, edited by Ainsley Hawthorne, both from Breakwater Books. And blessedly, she was featured in Acceptance, Stories at the Center of Us from Engen Books. Thank you very much for sharing your story with us, Daze, and also for coming on the Write Project podcast.
Thank you for having me, Matthew. I'm really excited to talk about writing.
Absolutely. So for those of you, if there's anyone out there who hasn't heard of Daze or her work thus far, you're really missing out, because I've been seeking out her stuff for the last 6 months anywhere I can after the deliberation process for Acceptance, because I was just in the meeting, kind of like a mediator, like if nothing went wrong, but if they had a question about publishing or something like that, I let the editors go crazy. But it was a double-blind process. You guys couldn't contact the editors, but also the editors didn't see the names of the people. They're not supposed to know. They're supposed to base it just on the story. That didn't end up happening in only one case, because Daze has such a unique voice and style and method of doing her fiction or her stories that both three editors said, we have a problem, because if that's not Daze Jefferies, someone's plagiarizing Daze Jefferies, and we need to, like, if it's Daze, we need to let them in. And if it's not Daze, we need to, like, kick their butt kind of thing. Like, that's plagiarism. So you so as soon as that happened, where I'm like, okay, if you get recognized for your style blind, you've got a cool style, and I need to check out more of your stuff. And sure enough, you've got a really cool style that's like to be commended.
Thank you. I think my voice has grown in conversation with a lot of other writers and feminist theorists in particular. I also am committed to writing with place and environments in rural Newfoundland and pulling from my history as a Bay girl. I also, find it really important to bring as much imagery and life into the work as possible, because most of my work deals with themes of haunting and loss, cultural loss, violence and longing. And so adding playfulness and adding the voice of a child into that work is also important for me.
Yeah, the theme of cultural loss in your work, I really found hit home a lot with me. It's something that I feel on a different level a lot. But if you're someone who doesn't fit in any way, even in a very minor way like me, the traditional role of Newfoundlander, especially if you're from around the Bay, but really anywhere here, it can be, I don't want to say disenfranchising, but yeah, disenfranchising. Like, people look at you like, well, why aren't you a Newfoundlander? And I'm like, I am. Maybe you should widen your definition of what a Newfoundlander is.
Absolutely. And I think, these recent developments in literary work are starting to carve out space, institutional space, to make room for so many different writers who have been either forcefully neglected from the literary canon, or who haven't had the access to traditional means of publishing in the province. I'm really grateful for the work that Ainsley is doing right now to both pay writers a living rate and to feature writers in these larger platforms.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's amazing. Ainsley does terrific work, but with both in her academic writing, her fiction writing, and her work with the Writers Alliance. She's the president over there right now. She's
Absolutely.
Yeah, major advocate for paying writers a living rate, which is important, obviously. Um, yeah, it's interesting with Land of Many Shores. I've got a copy of it behind me there, and I'm reading through it. I'm loving it. I'm about halfway through, except I skipped ahead to yours, obviously, when I first started. But um, I'm loving it, and I'm threatening to do something I might actually do because I gave it to a few people for Christmas, not because I thought they'd like it. I gave it to people I thought should read it, and then didn't really tell them what it was about and hoped they wouldn't read the back. um, and it was like you could use people who kind of convince themselves that like the stereotypical idea of Newfoundland is all that there is, and I'm like, here you go, Merry Christmas. Um, but I also kind of like there's an evil or maybe a good part of me that secretly wants to like strip off the cover and replace it with like a very like Newfoundlandia cover, like essays on what it means to be a Newfoundlander, and then like just put them out into the world in little bookshops and hope that people who wouldn't normally read it.
Right. I think, this book is coming at a time when people are not really prepared to encounter what they need to encounter. Um, I think what Land of Many Shores does best is offer so many unique perspectives from across Newfoundland and Labrador, across, different lines of race, class, ability, gender, sexuality, histories of trauma, different forms of cultural loss, outmigration, movements back to the province for a lot of people.
Yeah.
In ways that challenge, this long-standing, these long-standing motifs of resettlement, of people from St. John's writing about outport life when they really have no idea what they're talking about most of the time, making lots of money doing so. White authors romanticizing histories of the Beothuk time and time again in historical fiction. There are legacies of these works. And I think a lot of traditional Newfoundland texts need to be heavily problematized, and there will be futures where these works are asked to be accountable for their impact in the cultural landscape, perhaps. And what Land of Many Shores does is offer an alternative landscape, right, to consider the historical canon of literary work and then to imagine what else might come next.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I not that it's your like responsibility to decide how it gets dealt with or anything like that, but like if you the problems with Newfoundland canon, like some of the issues and how like people have been stigmatized before, how would you, when it's a classic Newfoundland work, ideally how would you alter that? And I'm legit asking, like, would it be like, all right, maybe this doesn't need to be in print, or is it like I know years ago when the Warner Brothers, not the Warner Brothers isn't from Newfoundland now, but when they released all the Looney Tunes shorts, some of them were really problematic, and they had like before you play, like when you press play on an episode, an expert would come on and be like, "Hey, just so you know," and explain like the cultural context in it, like, and it's like, okay, that's not bad, you know what I mean? Like that's a decent solution. Um, what do you feel about that? Like, how do you feel about some of the? Because I know some of the works I think you're talking about, and yeah,
I think the bigger, so I mean, I've matured in culture of feminist scholarship at Memorial. And so a lot of these texts are problematized in everyday teaching, right? And students offer their own interpretations of these works and like how the legacies that these works have, how they might, be underwritten moving forward or rewritten by others who haven't had access to publication. I think when we think about the history of writing and publication in Newfoundland Labrador, we center a group of particularly white men
yep,
who don't live in Newfoundland Labrador anymore to begin with and haven't published with Newfoundland Labrador presses. So if you're getting a $50,000 deal or a six-figure deal for 2 books from a larger press on the mainland, what are you doing with that money, right?
Yeah.
If you're writing about a world that you're not a part of, if you're contributing to these larger themes of romanticization in Newfoundland Labrador history, and you're not actually giving back to those communities, then I think, reparations in whatever form should be necessary. This is also a process of asking for accountability. Whether or not that will happen is unknown, and we can't foresee that. But I would hope that some of these bigger texts that were written 30, 20 years ago, authors have keyed in to some of the cultural conversations happening right now and are able to be reflexive about their own work, and at least not do the same things over and over again.
Yeah, it's one thing to say what should we do about stuff that's already out, but it's quite another thing to keep making the same mistakes. It's like, all right, first step, stop what you're doing. Like,
right.
Yeah. No, I like that. That's really good. And you're right. Like a lot of the author, I was on a meeting. I won't say with what, but they were talking about a marketing strategy, and they were talking about doing a video. And the person at the marketing agency put out the idea that like we should get this Newfoundlander and that Newfoundlander and this Newfoundlander on the writer on the video, talking about what we were promoting, and everyone they named hasn't lived in the province in 20 years, and I called them out on it, and the person said, well, Newfoundland's best authors don't live in Newfoundland anymore, and I'm like, you need to read more. I got very angry. I was not invited back.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this relates to larger conversations about out migration in the province, about actual economic or social or political landscapes that allow people to have meaningful and comfortable and stable lives, both on the island or in Labrador. And so these pushes out, right? And I think these narratives also center around white settler Newfoundlanders who, ideas of home in Newfoundland and Labrador are so complicated because of both the geographical placement of the province and its place in histories of capitalism and the New World and trade for centuries. But there are differences between the way that resettlement is romanticized for people in the Bay, as opposed to many Indigenous communities that are forcefully resettled due to violent colonial policies and legal movements. A lot of these things can't and shouldn't be written about by white settler Newfoundlanders, right? And so opening up space for Indigenous peoples to write their own stories about environment, about belonging, and about sovereignty is absolutely necessary. Do we have the infrastructure to support that right now? I'm not sure, but it is long needed. And larger conversations about Blackness in the province, about disability, how these things are interwoven, they emerge, within this community of voices in Land of Many Shores and in, growing journalism projects around the province that are happening right now. But I think these things are also connected to, the past 2 years where nobody can ignore the violence that is experienced by folks who are positioned differently in the world due to race and class. And I think I think there needs to be really important conversations about all these historical entanglements here on the local level. But people and writers in particular, in order to tell these stories, need to be able to do so in livable ways. And so we talk about, these big book deals on the mainland. We don't necessarily see those book deals happening here in the province. I'm not sure if that's because funding bodies don't necessarily allow Newfoundland Labrador presses to to do that for writers. And these are longer conversations about, arts and literary worlds in Newfoundland Labrador being marginalized by mainland Canada specifically. But there is a real problem when, writers aren't here, but they're writing about Newfoundland Labrador and not necessarily giving back to, people in the province right now who might need a bit more help.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking of that, like I've pushed for a long time, and everything you're saying is absolutely correct. But to me, the future of like the economics in this province is people like you, is people like Daze Jefferies, where like to me the answer for to make you sustainable and to make the province sustainable doesn't involve you leaving it. What it involves is your work leaving it. So you writing here and writing stuff that is marketed correctly to people outside the province. Like if people inside the province, wonderful. But to me, some books, and this is where I get into trouble, but there are some books that I've read from all publishers, mine included, that are very by Newfoundlander for Newfoundlander. And my problem with that economically as a businessman is that like it's robbing Peter to pay Paul kind of thing, where it's like, oh great, like you've taken money from a Newfoundlander and given it to another Newfoundlander who happens to own a business kind of thing, and kicked back a small position to the author who's also a Newfoundlander, but an even bigger percentage goes up the chain to the government through taxes and stuff like that. I much rather I love it when our ebooks say take off in the southern states, and they don't care that it's a Newfoundland writer, and they're paying for it and just bringing that money from wealthier places into the province. I would love to see Newfoundland be more of a because we have such writers and such diversity and such just wonderful arts community. I would love to see Newfoundland become, this is going to make some people mad, but a Hollywood type situation where it's like the only export we have is our art. We don't have the fish anymore, but let's make this a hub, and all the money comes in because of our wonderful art we have.
Right. And I think, I think the conversation about the commodification of Newfoundland culture is really important. I also studied folklore at Memorial, and so we had lots of these conversations about tourism and craft and art forms as they relate to capital and actual livability. And I think, there's also this bigger problem of so many people wanting a souvenir of Newfoundland Labrador, right? And I'm not sure that writing can often be a souvenir that invokes this feeling of, oh, I've been to Newfoundland, I love Newfoundland, everyone is the same, everyone's so, like these common motifs about who people are. Writing challenges so many of those things, right, in ways that crafts about mummers or, fish fillets or anything else, they uphold this certain narrative. A piece of writing asks you to engage differently, or at least, that's what I want to do in my writing. I think, within a current culture of queer and trans writing here as well, where changes are absolutely needed. And, I'm writing about, trying to survive within a political system that really doesn't do anything to keep you around. I'm 27 years old. A lot of my friends and peers are struggling to imagine futures here for a number of reasons: policy, the culture of work here, the way workers are treated, so on and so forth. I think to develop that infrastructure where Newfoundland Labrador artists are able to survive. I mean, these longer conversations about ArtsNL funding and what artists actually receive, and ArtsNL also working within very tight limits, how to change these things to give people the tools and opportunities to live comfortable lives is an ongoing question. The majority of my income has not been earned through my art and writing. It's been earned through sex work And that's been the reality of my life as a trans woman in this province. And so making that visible in my work has also been important, right? To have a platform and to have a voice, but to not necessarily have financial security from that at all. I think making that visible in my work is really important to share, especially with other trans writers who might be misled into thinking that there is some kind of security through literary work, when a lot of the time it's just not there for a number of reasons. And so, we keep having these conversations and pushing for changes, and then hopefully in the next decade we'll experience something differently.
Yeah, that is the hope, that the change is coming, and keep pushing for it, because it's necessary. You know what I mean? Like it's just necessary. Yeah.
So I've been writing from a young age, primarily poetry and short experimental works that helped me make sense of my place in the world as a young trans kid on the Northeast coast in a rural town. Um, I wrote about mermaids a lot. I always drew sea life and mermaids. These things, are still in my work today because my current writing practice reflects a lot on my childhood. Um, I started taking poetry seriously when I moved to St. John's and started attending spoken word poetry mics. Um, and then I started writing poems to share with other people in late 2014. And so from that point on, I was self-publishing chapbooks on PayHip and making a little bit of money here and there to
Oh, I
pay
gotta
for my
find those.
right. I think I took them down right now because, like all writers, I reflect on my early writing and then have lots of feelings about them.
I feel you. Yep.
But self-publishing those chapbooks was a way to fund transition stuff in my early transition, and so I think in total I made like close to $1,000 over three poetry chapbooks, and that money really helped. Right, so I would just be um, writing poems throughout the day. I would be sitting on the bus with a notebook like I have right now, and writing, found poetry, taking fragments of things I encountered or heard in the world and turning them into an art form, while, weaving them into my own life. Around 2014, I also started performing quite regularly and getting paid gig work. And so those things have, continued to grow over the past 7 years. Um, I don't know if I'm still a full-time writer, even though I'm writing all the time. And it's like, do we think about, if we
You're a
think about
professional writer, for
professional
sure.
writer, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of that writing has also been academic too, where money is also, you know, academia doesn't pay graduate students and they exploit graduate students like a lot of other institutions. And I have no problem speaking out about that
Yep.
either. Um,
We all
but yeah,
hear
like,
about the way that like college basketball and college football exploits their players because they're not paid, but we ignore like the way other parts of academia exploit studentry, and it happens a lot. Like,
right.
yeah.
So I've had to weigh these questions about, okay, the necessity and importance um, of my writing, the cultural weight that it bears, right? Whether or not that comes with money. And so for me, writing has been about creating and building upon a canon of queer and trans literary work for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, and opening up different ways of engaging with the written or performed word or text. And so for me, that hasn't always come with a paycheck, but I think about the longer questions and the theme of legacy that we discussed earlier is also important. So the weight of that work and what it will mean in the future, and so that's where I find hope and meaning in my writing most of the time.
Awesome, that's wonderful. Dig out that mermaid book. I want that. That sounds wonderful. Like that's genre but with deeper themes and ties to Newfoundland. That's my jam, man. That's what Engen's about.
Right. I never stop thinking about mermaids. Mermaids have been the long-standing emotional figuration in my life. And I think there's a lot of room to explore, um, mermaid history and culture as a trans woman as a rural trans woman in the Newfoundland Labrador context. And so thinking about, um, this double-edged sword of sexualization and violence against mermaids that has existed here for centuries, and reading that into the present day in the lives of trans women and sex workers offers a lot of conceptual potential. And I think drawing on the figuration of the mermaid might allow a lot of other people to consider the everyday lives of trans people and sex workers here in different ways,
Yeah.
in ways that are connected to the environment and in ways that always, carry the presence of transness in Newfoundland Labrador history.
Yeah. I'm thinking
So I
about
would be
some of
happy to
the,
expand on it.
I'm thinking of like the different like mythologies surrounding mermaids and how much of it is just like could be allegorical to a trans lifestyle, like even just so simple as like from the Disney version, like you can change but you lose your voice kind of thing. It's like, oh, that's a thing. Like losing your voice is always like, and maintaining your voice is always a thing when you're, yeah, okay, there's a lot
Right.
that's shocked. Yeah,
There are
okay.
bigger conversations about voice, about deception and mistrust, about fear, about sexualization and violence, and how all these things are interwoven. So I think like Dale Jarvis in particular has done a lot of recent work on the history of mer culture. Corey Thorne, who's a professor at Memorial, has also done a lot of work. And so he's analyzed masculinity and merfolk and the Merbies, but I stay with the realm of feminine and that violence and sexualization. Um, and so, yeah, I'm always writing poems. I'm always making weird little drawings, and I'm hoping to expand into more long form fictional writing in the future. So I would be happy to continue these conversations with you.
1 second. No one in Radioland will be able to see this, but the first book that made Engen a publisher was called The Sea by Amanda LaPonte.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yes, beautiful. Mermaids, man, love it. Okay. All right. Good. If you didn't write, what would you do for your work/art?
So I also work with visual art and sound and music a lot, and so these have been entangled art forms in my life. Again, from an early age, I was lucky to have supportive parents who really fostered and encouraged art in my life. And so I took piano lessons from a young age. I started, making my own electronic music from the age of 13 onward. I recorded a lot of albums as a teenager. I was like doing a lot of stuff as a teenager because that was my lifeline as a rural child who was different and who was bullied relentlessly. And so, a lot of these things come through in Abandoned Land Child, my piece for acceptance, um, to make sense of the hopes and dreams of rural trans or queer children. And so art and music and writing held me up. So if I wasn't writing, I would still be making art and still be playing around with sound like I do now. I also am a researcher, so I'm always grappling with scholarly questions. I love working with archives. Um, so yeah, I think I would be pulling from bits and pieces, just playing around with things that make my life livable and allow me to think more deeply and give me a deeper understanding and help me find meaning.
Rock on. Okay, love it.
I'm not concerned with money for the most part.
Okay, love it. Do you think that someone can be a writer if they don't feel emotions strongly?
I mean, I guess these if you
You,
put words on a page or on a screen or whatever, you are engaged in the act of writing. What that work, the function of that work, will work itself out. If it's meant to have an impact, it will, and if it doesn't, it won't. So I don't know if there's good or bad writing.
Well, thank you for joining us, Daze Jefferies. As you can tell, she is very politically minded. She does not mind speaking out about these issues, and that is a good thing. These things need to be heard. So again, you can check her work out in Transversing and Land of Many Shores from Breakwater Books and Acceptance from Engen Books. And thank you very much for coming on the program, Daze.
Thank you so much. I'm always happy to talk about these things.
Awesome. Come back anytime. Anytime you want to yell at stuff, the Write Project podcast, you're a writer now. So there's any excuse for you to come on, yell at stuff, even if it's not writing related.
I'm so down.
Okay, awesome.